Hello and welcome to Global. I'm Tim Willcox. The striking images of people making perilous journeys from war-torn and impoverished countries seeking a better life in Europe have defined this summer and autumn. The greatest numbers are coming from Syria and Afghanistan, but many thousands of those seeking a better life are also coming from across Africa. In a moment, we'll be hearing from our correspondent in Malta, where a summit of European and African leaders is being held to try and tackle the problem. But first, Clive Myrie reports from northern Ethiopia, where the brutal dictatorship of Eritrea is pushing many of its citizens into attempting that dangerous journey to Europe.
It's a familiar sight for Ethiopia's border troops. Yet another vehicle winding its way from the frontier with Eritrea. And on board, exiles left with no choice but to start afresh. Their old lives not worth living. The welcome is friendly. The refugees weary. This bewildered girl made the journey with her aunt. We found a policeman, teachers, 3 soldiers. Some walked for days to reach the border before being picked up by Ethiopian troops. Eritrea is hemorrhaging its people at an alarming rate. Last year, more than 30,000 ended up in refugee camps in northern Ethiopia. Those now receiving help are escaping a brutal dictatorship, a land where there's no freedom of speech, no rule by democratic law, and where there's open-ended military conscription for everyone.
We do athletics at school.
Alem was a teacher in Eritrea, now helping fellow exiles.
Pay attention, please.
Like all those we spoke to, he didn't want to give his surname for fear of government reprisals against his family back home.
The government is trying to control or to dominate everything. If you want to participate in the political activities, they don't want actually. They are dictating Eritreans.
For some, all this is just a staging post. This is the beginning, not the end of their journey. The final destination is often northern Europe, west into Sudan, further north into Egypt, and then across the Mediterranean. In fact, only Syria provides more people in the current migration crisis trying to get into the European Union than Eritrea. In this camp, it's important to keep your phone charged, to call relatives who've already reached Europe, and for some, to transfer money to traffickers. The journey out of the camp is one Mary began, but didn't finish. Trying to reach Sudan, the traffickers she'd paid sold her to bandits. They held her for ransom, and when she tried to escape, she was tortured.
My left ear is badly damaged, where they hit me. They beat me on the soles of my feet. I have trouble walking now. And on my back, they used a cattle prod to burn me.
Traumatized and a long way from home, her experience sadly part of the narrative of the refugee.
Okay, number 3.
It's the plight of people like Mary and Alem that will be discussed at the Malta Migration Summit. How best to prevent more Eritreans and other Africans leaving their homeland to head for Europe. At the end of our interview, Alem broke down. What future for him? Clive Myrie, BBC News in northern Ethiopia.
Well, let's go straight to the BBC's Chris Morris, who's at that meeting in Valletta, Malta's capital city. More than 50 leaders there. Chris, what are the key objectives of this meeting?
I think it depends a little bit on which side of the Mediterranean you come from. European leaders essentially are offering more for more. We will give you more aid if you give us more help in A, preventing people from making these perilous journeys across the Mediterranean in the first place, and B, probably more controversially, more help in returning those whose asylum applications fail. And don't forget, on that score, we're not just talking about people who've arrived in the last year or two, but some people who've been there perhaps a decade and more, have put down roots but are still living in effect illegally without papers in Europe. From the African perspective, I think they're looking for much more assistance, and they're worried about remittances from people working in Europe. If a lot of people get sent back, some countries will suffer severely because they are very, very heavily dependent on the money that African workers send back to their economies. And the kind of aid that is on offer from the European Union, even if it stretches to billions of euros, may not replace all that money if the EU takes a really hard line and over time tries to send nearly all these people working illegally back home.
And that figure, I think, what 1.8 billion euros is being offered, or that's the figure that people are talking about. Is that just, though, to actually repatriate them, to actually sort of send them home, or does it actually feed into the economy back at home?
No, it's meant to feed into the economy back home. It's 1.8 billion euros pledged by the European Commission, and they hope that other national governments will sort of meet that amount with individual pledges of their own. Some of it, though, is to try and deal with issues which everyone knows will take decades to resolve. Poverty alleviation, conflict resolution. These are not things that you can resolve in just a few weeks. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge, certainly for European politicians. There are demands for quick fix answers, and yet they know that many of the solutions lie in patient, painstaking work on issues like economic development, building better long-term relationships with countries, some of which have governments with questionable human rights records. So there are no easy answers, but there is this demand that at least we have to try and do something to avoid the impression that not just with Syrians coming via Turkey to Greece, but with Africans crossing the Mediterranean as well, that our systems in Europe are simply being overwhelmed by the scale of the problem.
OK, Chris Morris with the latest from Valletta. Thank you very much indeed. Well, with me in the studio is Onyekachi, who's director of Forward UK, an organisation which works to involve Africans abroad more directly in Africa's development. Thank you for joining us on Global. I mean, the people traffickers are at the root of this in the countries of origin, aren't they? What can be done to stop them?
No, I disagree that the people traffickers are at the root. They're meeting a demand. We need to deal fundamentally with the demand, and the demand is being driven by a number of factors. Some of it is conflict, some of it is environmental, but a lot of it is economic. People want a better living, and until we deal with the issue of jobs, we won't solve this problem.
But is that problem going to be resolved by simply Europe paying money into these African economies? It's not, is it? No,
it's a global problem. I mean, what we have is a global system in which Africa can't generate the jobs. The African population is going to double in the next up to 2050. And there's simply not enough jobs being generated. So the task is, how do we calibrate the global economy so that Africa has a more meaningful role in it rather than just as a producer of excess labour? At the moment, what we're seeing, Africa exports labour. What we're seeing is that labour being exported in a dysfunctional and irregular manner.
But this is also something to do with sort of the due diligence of countries as well in terms of corruption and systems, isn't it, as well?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and we all know that there's a role to play in getting better governance in the countries and ensuring that some form of industrialization takes place. China has been the great example over the last 20 years. 400 million people pulled out of poverty, and you don't see the same kinds of waves of people leaving China because they have a stake in their own.
But the Chinese model is also being used in Africa as well, isn't it, in terms of giving aid? I mean, they are actually putting industry into Africa.
Yeah. Well, what they've been attempting to do is to build infrastructure and look at the ways that they industrialize very quickly. But sometimes, one model isn't as easily transferable. But I think that that's been the approach that they've been trying to invest in.
We started
Africa
by talking about people traffickers.
Yes,
isn't it, though, beholden on governments, African governments, to try and stop that? You say they're just meeting the demand, but if you actually took them out of the equation, that would address the short-term problems, wouldn't it?
Well, we think the organisation I work with, that there's a short-term problem, a medium-term problem, and then the longer-term problem. The short-term one is the security issue around how we stop the disasters across the Mediterranean. The medium-term one is about the traffickers, and yes, we do need to deal with them. But the longer-term one that will deal with this is how do we generate the jobs and the industry and the kinds of structures that mean that people can stay at home and have hope. And for me, that's the biggest challenge.
Okay, Onyekachi, thank you very much indeed
Thank you.
for joining us on Global. More details have emerged of Russian draft proposals on the future of Syria. A document circulating at the United Nations proposes a constitutional reform process taking up to 18 months, followed by new presidential elections. Islamic State would be listed as a terrorist organisation by the UN Security Council to stop it selling oil stocks to raise funds.